and myself. We are going to talk about direct-to-disc recording, and it's one of those things that audiophiles like me always we've loved since day one. The direct-to-disc is always the best sounding version. And Steve was involved with M&K RealTime Records for Duke, Flamenco Fever, Father Heinz, and various others. And various others that I did not know even existed. So we've invited Steve here to talk about recording and play us some music. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Thank you all for coming on Sunday, late in the show. Hope you've been enjoying the show. And we're this is Gary. Is this the first one in Seattle? And
yes.
How long?
This is the first one in Seattle. Nobody can remember any other ever.
I don't recall. So hopefully it's the start of a trend, and you'll be getting more shows coming in. I've now had a lifetime in the audio business and have been involved in a wide range of parts of it, from my start as just an audiophile and a music lover, and then getting involved in the business through sales, and then into recording, and then becoming a designer of my own equipment line. But my involvement with the direct-to-disc, the real-time direct-to-disc, goes back to when I moved to Los Angeles in the mid-'70s, so circa 1976. I went to work for Jonas Miller Sound in Beverly Hills. So that was, one of the really preeminent hi-fi shops in the country at that time. The other one, arguably, being Lyric Hi-Fi. And you could make a good argument for a few others, but certainly on the West Coast, Jonas Miller Sound was kind of a go-to location for high-end audio. I went to work there as a salesman. Jonas Miller Sound was a big building, just a big open building, 2 stories, and in the front section of it, where the store was, it was open all the way to the upper ceiling, and we subdivided the floor space with movable dividers to create these spaces for having systems set up. And then as you went through the store toward the back, you came to a hallway, and the offices were on one side, and then Ken's studio was on the other side. And a little further back down the hallway was another, like the main listening room for Jonas Miller Sound, a dedicated listening space. And then behind that was storage space and warehousing and whatnot. And then upstairs in the back, that was built out, and then that became the offices of M&K Sound, Miller and Kreisel. So by the time I got there, Ken Kreisel was deeply involved in making his own recordings. He did a lot of live field recording with a Stellamaster deck, and made great recordings, some of which he then later released as LPs, some collections of things. But he knew even then that he wanted to make direct-to-disc records. He wanted to try to make technically the best records that had ever been made. And so after I'd worked at Jonas Miller for a couple of years, he asked me to come and work with him at M&K Sound, which I was happy to do. And that was really doing sales and marketing and that sort of thing, and product development work with him for M&K. And I had gotten into the business end of things originally. Well, I was led there because I wanted to become a recording engineer. That was kind of my goal at the time. I had purchased some gear, some microphones, and a deck, and was doing my own field recordings and whatnot. What I was never able to do was actually find a job in a studio. So it turned out then that because I got involved with M&K Sound and Ken wanted to do the direct-to-disc recordings, I got to ultimately become a recording engineer in a kind of a roundabout way. So Ken, Get this record here. Ken invested in the Neumann VMS70 lathe system. Now you may have heard that name or that term. Scully was an older name, and the other, preferred lathe system by Doug Sachs and various other people. But Ken went with what was then kind of the state-of-the-art, latest lathe system, the Neumann VMS70, and you can see the main lathe arrangement here. And you'll notice also on this picture, this is an album called Flamenco Fever. So once Ken brought the lathe into the studio, and this was in Jonas Miller Sound, when all the initial recordings were done in the store, we would move all the equipment out of the way. Ken had purchased a grand piano that was out in the main floor, and we would set up the musicians out there and microphones, and then run the cabling back into the studio where Ken had his mixing arrangement and the lathe set up. So when you get the Neumann lathe, it comes with a large rack of electronics that are all the control, drive electronics, and the amplifiers to run the cutter head on there. And Ken, being the purist that he immediately disabled the current limiters and acceleration limiters in this system, which put the cutter heads at risk every time we did a recording, and he lived in fear of burning out the very expensive cutter heads, but we never did. I think he turned up the helium flow, I believe, to increase the cooling factor a bit, but anyway, we managed to run incredibly high levels into the cutter head and didn't burn them out. But the other thing I want to point out here is that the lathe is in this club. This is a flamenco club in the LA area, and so once several recordings had been done, all the initial ones, including some of the better known stuff, the Ford Duke and the Earl Father Hines and the Hot Sticks, Ken got it in his head to do live on location direct-to-disc recordings. So we broke all this down, took it all apart, loaded it up in a big van, and drove it out to these locations. And so this was done live on location over a period of 2 days. You'll hear some of these later on. The encore, the Roger Wagner Chorale, was a live concert. It was live on location, and it's one of those situations where there's an audience. We have no control over that, so everything had to be ready to go. The only control was that Ken had pre-arranged with the conductor that it would take, the side of the record could go so long, so they had to fit the program material, and then he had to switch lacquers. But this was a case where everything had to work correctly the first time. If something had gone wrong, in the cutting process, as does happen, then we would have lost, those recordings. In this case, we had, this was done privately. Ken had prearranged this. We had the club for 2 days, and we could go set it up. He could get things dialed in, the way he wanted them to be, and did some recording, and then we came back the second day to finish it off. And so this was, it's again in the LA area, a flamenco club. So we had all of the equipment in a trailer there, and Ken agonized over what to do about the equipment overnight. He was afraid to leave it in the club for fear of it getting stolen. It was a slightly rough neighborhood. So the compromise wound up being me sleeping overnight in the van, locked in with all of the recording equipment.
With a shotgun.
Well, actually, no, it was a pistol. So happily, I'm here to tell the tale, and nothing happened. But it was a fascinating time, and learned an awful lot. So all of all of the direct-to-disc, recordings that you may be aware of, are familiar with in the catalog from RealTime, most of which were recorded in Jonas Miller Sound as a, call it a studio. And Ken had purchased a number of AKG C414 microphones that he then modified for this use, and a few other 451s for some additional use, but primarily it was the C414s. And what he did is we were a Mark Levinson dealer at the time, so Jonas Miller Sound sold Mark Levinson equipment. So Ken got a stack of ML2 Levinson preamplifiers, and we removed the RIAA equalization from the phono stage. That became the microphone preamp. So those were out in the recording area. All the microphones fed these Levinson ML2 preamps, and then those in turn fed the cables into the recording studio, where Ken had rigged up a passive mixer. So he had Penny and Giles linear faders to do all of his mixing live there, and then that fed a Levinson LNP2 master preamplifier, which then in turn fed the lathe amplifiers.
How many channels were you normally running?
Well, that would vary quite a bit from one recording to another, but like in Ford Duke, I wish I could answer that question right off the top of my head, but I think we had on the order of at least 8, maybe 10 mics. So I think we had a stack of maybe 5 ML2 preamps.
Use any omnidirectionals?
No. The AKGs were switchable pattern, but I shouldn't be quite so fast to say no. There were some occasions when he did use omni patterns in those, but typically it was cardioid. They had a couple of different cardioid patterns, and so that you could get some isolation, because all of these were done live. All of these groups we're talking about were gathered together in this main room and playing this music live. So For Duke is one of the better known of the albums. Bill Berry and the Duke Ellington All-Stars band. And Ken liked to do stereo miking of each individual instrument as much as possible. So that's one of the reasons for the sound the way it comes out. He was a strong believer in that, and I think that has real merit. So you get more of a sense of an acoustic space for each set of instruments, but they're all gathered around. Piano, of course, is fixed in one spot, and we would have, in this case, Ray Brown, bass player, then the drummer, and then the horn guys were kind of spread out around the room with their microphone setups. They came in, this group was, there was a man named Ralph Youngheim who was acting as a producer, and he really knew the musicians and the music, and he arranged, the particular group of musicians to come in and set this up. So these guys are, very well known, high-end jazz musicians that are used to playing live gigs, but also used to some studio recording. But now they're being presented with this new thing, direct to disc. So it's like, okay, guys, you got to come in. We figured out a program of what you're going to play, and you got to play it straight through these, 3 tracks, 4 tracks, and there's, you play the track, you end. There's a brief pause, and then you go again, and so they thought that was a little bit odd, but okay, they're willing to kind of go along with the gag. Well, then it turns out that what Ken wanted is, we did this, played it through, got everything set up, and there's a lot of work in that. Play this set of music through. Well, then Ken's saying, okay, do it again. Now we need another take. And they're kind of, like, we just played it. Was there anything wrong with what we just did? No, we need another take. Okay, do it again. So they did, played it again. Ken got the next recording. okay, do it again. And now they're kind of going, this is like, really? You just did it twice, you know, but no, third time, all right. So they did it again. Then it's time for side two, so it's all of that again. By the time they got done, I got to hand it to them. They were very professional. They did it beautifully. They may have grumbled, I'm sure they did grumble a little bit to themselves. It's like, this is kind of nutty, why would we do this? But they did it. And we actually had just a few people in as a kind of an audience in the store while this was going on. But they pulled it off incredibly well. Now there's another interesting story that goes along with that. That was, I'm thinking that may have been the very first commercial release on the RealTime label. It was not the first recording that Ken did. Trying to remember. Yeah, RT 101. I think this was the first commercial release. So Ken had done a few test recordings of some other things before this one, and that came out later on. But this was sort of the first official recording for commercial release done by RealTime Records. And so we had these 3 different takes. We had good lacquers for 3 takes for each side. And Ken had already decided by this point in time that the best records were being produced by Teldec in West Germany. So when the lacquers were done, they were sent to Teldec for plating and pressing. And then we would get back test pressings from Teldec and listen to those, and Ken would, you know, pass on those or not. So this was the first commercial release. After all this work, Ken chose the 2 lacquers for the best sets, the ones he wanted, packed them up, sent them to Teldec in West Germany. They were never seen again. That is true to this day. And so, you know, you can laugh or you can cry, but there's nothing you can do.
Jeez.
And so he had to take the second set and send those along, and so that's what we wind up with.
Was it Teldec that stole them, or they got lost in shipping? I'm sorry, was it the company you were sending them to that absconded with them, or they were lost in shipping?
I don't remember those details. It's been too long. I have a vague recollection that Teldec may have received them somehow, but I couldn't swear to that either. Anyway, the point is they were lost and never found again.
They didn't have the tracking back then that we have now.
Well, you know, direct to disc is a one-shot thing. It's the
Like shipping tracking. Yeah.
oh, true. Well, even if it was trackable, it just ended somewhere. The tracking was gone. As I said, maybe they made it to Teldec and then were lost, but I don't remember that detail. But there was nothing we could do. So Ken sent the next set of lacquers over there, and then this is what we got back. And this was one of the very interesting lessons for me, just in terms of realities of producing records. And that is that, Ken was cutting lacquers on this lathe, and occasionally the lacquer he'd have to stop. It'd be called a blown lacquer. Something would happen and you couldn't continue, etc. So there'd be these sometimes partial lacquers or test things that he'd been working on, and I could take those into the back room, the main listening room at Jonas Miller, and play them there.
Oh, jeez.
And I have to tell you that those lacquers fresh off of the lathe is the best sound reproduction I've ever heard. And I naively expected the records when they came back to sound just like that. But that's unfortunately not the case. There is some loss in that process. And so, we listen to these records now and they sound phenomenal.
I brought a lacquer.
Pardon?
I brought a direct to this lacquer.
but not this one.
Not that. Interestingly, I heard this story from Steve the first time he did a presentation at the Pacific Northwest Audio Society. And when I did my direct to this recording, I drove the lacquers to RPI, to the pressing plant.
You didn't drive them to Germany.
I didn't drive to Germany.
Yeah. Yes.
You also recorded direct to tape 2-track, right, of that session?
Yeah, there was a backup tape machine that anything that was done in the studio facility there. I can't remember if Ken may have had his Stellamaster with us on the location once for backups, but he would run tape as well, and some of those tapes were then used to release CDs later on, CD versions. But that was another point. When you compared the best tape machine, the best tape, the best everything Ken could get at the time, with again the playback of these lacquers, we could play it back on the lathe. You had a transcription tone arm there, and in the studio, play these things back. And so again, listening to the tape was a disappointment. It's like, huh,
I brought the tape too, so we can hear.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it takes a little while to get past that to where you no longer have the experience of hearing that lacquer like fresh in your mind. Then you can go back and play these or the tapes or things like that, and they sound amazing. They sound fantastic. But at the time, I just had this experience of being let down. It was like I wanted those pressings to sound just like what we were hearing off of the lacquers, but you lose a little bit in the process. That's just part of the deal.
Just touching on what we're talking about here, you playing the original lacquer, could you just touch a little bit on the process from the original lacquer? And I'm guessing the original lacquer, you're stamping out some mothers, and the mothers are the ones that do the actual pressings of the product that you're selling?
I mean, you're correct. The lacquers are sent to a plant which then runs them through a plating bath.
Okay.
They're plated with nickel, I believe it is.
So you can press several thousand.
Silver.
Oh yeah, that's right. They get a silver spray for it to be conductive.
To be conductive. First, what they do is they put the lacquer on this machine that spins the lacquer. They spray a colloidal silver on it because you need the silver. It cannot be grainy. It needs to be as fine as possible.
Yeah.
So it's a colloidal silver spray multiple times until it becomes conductive. Then they put it into a plating bath, and the plating is nickel. You're right, it's a nickel plate.
Yeah.
And depending on how long you leave them in this nickel bath, then you get the thickness of either the mother, or in the case of a one-step, the stamper. So the mother is nickel, and when you separate the lacquer from the mother, when you separate the first step is called convert or a father.
It's a reversal, actually.
It's a reverse, so
Right.
it's negative. And from there you use another plating bar to make a mother.
Yeah.
Then from the mother you make a stamper, and from the stamper you stamp.
And you can
For
make multiple
You can make
stampers.
multiple
Typically, you
stampers.
make multiple
Oh, yeah.
stampers, and the stampers wear out as they're being used. And so this is why you'll find some of the better pressing companies, they'll number the pressings as they come off a particular press.
So you know if you got some of the first or
Exactly,
the last
and they'll
ones.
limit the runs so that they don't use a stamper any more than some particular number.
What are they normally limited to, like 5,000, 20,000?
No, a few hundred.
Oh,
well,
yeah, really?
okay, in this case, excuse me, for normal commercial pressings, I don't even know that answer.
Yeah. Who
But
knows?
hundreds, if they get into thousands, I do not know the answer to that. But then people who get really into this start asking, well, okay, what press was that made on? Because they'll have different presses, and they all produce slightly different sounding results. And then it comes down in some cases to who was operating the press, because it was like Ed, the old timer. Yeah, he makes the best pressings. So it even gets into those kind of weeds. And as Gary knows very well, the formulation for the vinyl that's being pressed is a key factor in ultimately the sound that these things produce. And again, that was something I didn't learn until later on, that was even a thing, like the formulation of the pellets.
Is that true of other different lacquer materials as well?
Well, yes, but like Ken had settled at the time on lacquers made by a French company called Pyrol, and they're long gone. And in fact, they disappeared fairly early on, and Ken had purchased some number of these lacquers that then he coveted. He treasured those because he liked them better than anybody else's lacquers. But there are different there were different companies making lacquers. Now it's down to just one. Yeah. One in some place was destroyed in a fire not too long ago.
Fire and the plant in the US burned down. So it's only one company that makes lacquers anymore.
Wow.
But they're made usually on an aluminum substrate, and it's this acetate or lacquer formulation is spread evenly on these, and then you get the right formulation. It has just the right mechanical characteristics, so that when you put it on the lathe and you drop the cutting stylus, which is heated in there, that you get this very smooth cut and a perfect chip. It's this little bit of removed material, which is quite flammable, and the lathe has a vacuum. It's got a little suction tube that follows along, and you have to get things lined up so that when you do drop the cutter head in and start this process, you got to get the chip fed into the vacuum, and that's this little tiny thread that just is continuously sucked into this bottle off to the side. And after you do that for a while, you got this glass jar that's partially full of this stuff that is incredibly flammable. And it's like almost explosively flammable, so you do have to.
Where's this company? Is it North America or is it Germany or what?
I'm sorry, which?
Where's this company that does lacquers?
Right now, I think there's one in Japan.
There's only one in Japan.
Yeah, there used to be some here, and maybe the ones in Europe closed down. So that's a real problem for people who want to make new LPs at this point in time. Let's see.
Are we going to listen to a lacquer today? Are you going to play the
Gary brought
lacquer?
a lacquer from.
After Steve gets done, I'll tell you how much trouble there is after you are done with the recording.
Okay.
Because I've brought three different vinyl formulations.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And a lacquer and the tape.
Okay.
So this was a wonderful learning experience, and just being there at this time and place and getting to be involved in the process of making these records and doing these live on location direct to disc recordings. A lot of great memories from that, but a lot of work and a lot of nail biting went into it. The one little story on the Roger Wagner chorale. Again, live concert, audience of hundreds of people for this performance of the Roger Wagner chorale. And so again, all this is prearranged with Ken and the director, but it's a live audience thing, so everything has to work. There are no second chances on any of this stuff. And in that particular instance, there were three of us. Ken Kreisel is the primary engineer, and he's the motivating force behind all of these records. And when you hear M&K sound, that's Miller and Kreisel. Jonas Miller was the store owner and the main business partner. Ken started M&K Sound building large high-performance subwoofers initially, and then branched out into speakers. But then he also got into doing what he really wanted to do, which was the direct-to-disc records. But then I think there's something like 14 or 15 total in the catalog, and I was involved with most of those, not all. But there were some very interesting experiences. So this Roger Wagner chorale thing, it was Ken Kreisel, myself, and Steve Decker, who was the lathe operator. Ken was doing the live mixing, and I was setting up all the equipment, setting up the microphones, running the cables, doing all that stuff. So in this case, Ken and Steve Decker were setting up the equipment, and they had a ground hum that they just could not get rid of. And so I set up the mics. In this case, it was a 2-mic recording, slightly modified ORTF arrangement with the cardioid pattern, the wide cardioid pattern on these mics. And I gave it my best shot. I did just based on experience the best I could, figuring that Ken would come out and then adjust things as needed or say yes or no or whatever. He never could. They worked to fix this electrical hum problem right up to the beginning of the concert, and they did get it fixed. They finally got it resolved, but just in time to put the acetate on, drop it in, and go. So that was another nail biter. Then a record that I don't have here is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And so this was a great big production with a huge choir, full orchestra.
That was done direct to disc?
Yes.
Wow.
And another live on location. And that's another one where we had a couple of days to get everything set up. But that was also done with 2 mics only on a very tall mic stand that was located like maybe row 6 or 5 or something out, in the audience, but a good 10 or 12 feet up in the air. And so I had the experience of going out to adjust the microphone positioning while this orchestra was practicing. So there was a big ladder out there. So I got to climb up on this ladder and tweak the positioning of the microphones according to what Ken wanted while this orchestra is going full tilt, the choir, the whole thing. I've sat there for a while on top of this ladder.
Was there an audience?
No, it was just me. In a position that nobody ever gets to be in.
Suspended.
So that was quite a memory. But here's the kind of the final kicker to this whole episode, which I still to this day I find fascinating. But right toward the end, we're talking later 70s, so it's like 79, somewhere in there. One day, I'm in there at work, and here's engineers from Sony there to show off their latest digital recording equipment. And this is, Ken had invited them. They came in and set up this whole thing in the studio. So this was pre-introduction of CD, but this was the recording process for CD that had been developed by Sony and Philips, and Sony had all the equipment to make it work. And they showed up and put on this demonstration for Ken of this whole process. Ken looked at that all very carefully, and he just went, "That's it, I'm sold." That's all of this stuff, forget it. Digital recording is the way to go. And he sold the lathe system off and never looked back, switched over to digital recording. And I will say he made some very good sounding CDs. But I was fascinated that he was just that completely convinced, that when he saw this whole process and saw what it could do. And I did ask him at one point in time, I said something to him about why would you not at least keep the lathe and all of the analog recording gear? And he just said, well, try to record at 10 kilohertz square wave on a tape, on an LP. Yeah. And I go, okay, that's a fair question. I mean, when you put it in those terms, you can't do that with tape or with the LP either. Pardon?
Who wants to listen to this?
Well, it's a test.
It's a in some sense, a benchmark of the capabilities of the system. But for Ken, that was a convincing argument because he was going to get better fidelity out of that system than he was out of any of this analog
I mean,
stuff.
when digital first started, it was considered to be kind of harsh. You know, it was just too perfect, too stark in comparison to the warmth that you get from vinyl.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of controversy.
Of course, it's much improved. I mean,
among
they've taken care of
audiophiles.
that now.
But it was one of those things where the audiophiles are less than a flea on the ass of an elephant in the marketplace as a whole.
Yeah.
Controversy among audiophiles?
I know it's hard to believe.
Say it is yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Were you ever involved in the Diana Carroll with the Duke Ellington Orchestra tribute to Ethel Waters direct-to-disc? Were you involved in that one?
No. Only the RealTime.
Only real-time.
Direct to discs. There were a number of others at the time. Doug Sachs was he had done several before Ken released his, and then a bunch of other companies came along and did direct to discs at the time. There were more of them right around that point in time.
Sheffield Labs was one of the ones.
But everybody pretty quickly realized that given the difficulties involved and how many you were likely to sell, it didn't make a lot of good commercial sense. But as a purist kind of approach, it's remarkable what you can get onto a vinyl LP. Anyway, that was the end of my adventure with direct to disc, and I moved on from there to other things, and so did Ken. But he continued recording and continued the RealTime label, but it was all then digital at that point. I was just reminded too of something. Let me get this up. It was getting to see the process of these records being cut was fascinating and an interesting learning experience. But it's a little bit difficult to see here, but off to the side you can see there's a microscope that comes with the lathe system. And that microscope lets you see those grooves up close and personal. You can see exactly what's going on. And it was very useful for, looking for errors, problems, and, the way Ken was cutting these things by having removed the acceleration limiters and current limiters and that sort of thing, it wasn't difficult to have so much excursion of the cutting style so that it would cut into an adjacent groove, and then that would be a blown lacquer. Also, because of this process, there's no preview involved of the music that's coming up. So you have to know the music well enough to know what kind of spacing pitch you need. And so Ken was controlling that manually. There was a knob there, and he could adjust the pitch as they were playing because he hopefully knew in advance when things were going to get really loud and dynamic or huge bass notes were coming along, all of that sort of thing. So that, again, he had to do that manually. But I remember looking at some things through this microscope, and there's this one memory I have in particular of looking at a lacquer. And again, this is an analog process, and it has only so much bandwidth and rise time capability and that sort of thing. But I'm looking through this groove, and all of a sudden I see this excursion that I swear was at a 90-degree angle. It just went off like that. And that you can't play that back.
1812 cannon shot?
No, it was one of the things we were working on. It might have been from Eddie Graham and the Hot Sticks album, but that was very interesting to see. It's like I didn't think it could do that.
I remember Hot Sticks used to be the cheapest of the M&K RealTime.
Okay.
Because nobody could track them.
Oh,
we didn't have
yeah.
cartridges that could track them. Maybe a
Oh, I got a-
15 type 2,
I got a great story about that.
You just put up with the mistracking.
Yeah.
So this is the record that we're talking about. So this is drummer, Eddie Graham, and he worked with Earl Father Hines, but Ken had him come into the studio and cut this record. And there's it's extended drum solos and things, and it's quite interesting. I gotta say, he did a great job. But there's a part of it where he goes real soft. He starts playing very, very softly, and he gets his mallets out and he's playing real softly, and takes his sticks and holds it against like the drum head and runs his handle on that, which creates this very low frequency thrumming kind of sound. And that goes on for like a few minutes, and then all of a sudden, bam, he just lays into the drums again and takes off. So back in these days, there were a few shows around the country where Ken wanted to show off his then new satellite speakers and this one of the very first powered subwoofers to be offered, the Volkswoofer. And so we did some shows around the country where he had his SP10 turntable, Levinson gear, and the new speakers, and playing our various records, including this one. Now Ken, he liked to demo loud. I mean, seriously loud. It was more than I could sometimes take, and I'd have to step out into the hallway. But he felt that kind of loudness level brought people into the room. And I remember there was a show at the Statler Hilton, which I think is gone now, in New York City. And he had the setup. So it's a hotel room situation like this, in a much smaller room than where we are now, but kind of a regular hotel room size. And the room was packed. There were enough people at these shows. I mean, the rooms would just literally get packed. And it was fascinating because the room would be packed, but only so far. And there were no barriers there. People could have gone as close to the speakers as they wanted to go, but the room would be packed like a sardine can right up to a point. And there'd be like an imaginary line there, and nobody was going past that line. But it was a new experience for people at the time, because here was these relatively small satellite speakers, a two-way satellite speaker but with 4 drivers, on a stand close to the back wall, and then these two powered subwoofers down below. But unless you were right at the front of that line of people, you couldn't see the subwoofers. You wouldn't necessarily know. And here's this amazing wall of sound, including powerful bass coming out of this system, and people were quite puzzled, quite taken aback. So there's a couple of funny memories I have. This one guy comes in and he's got his young daughter on his shoulders, and he comes in and he kind of works his way into this crowd, and this is cranking away. So again, all he's seeing are these 2 small speakers up against the back of the room. And at one point the daughter leans over to him and goes, "Daddy, how do they do that?" And this guy's going, "I don't know." But the funniest thing of all was when this was playing, it got to the point where he starts playing real softly. And this, I don't want to be ethnically insensitive, and not that it matters, but there was a Japanese man who came into the room. And he's a little smaller than a lot of the other people in the audience. So he had to kind of work his way through the crowd up toward the front. And he got up there right as the soft passage was playing. And I'm seeing all this happen, and he gets up there, and he finally gets through where he can see the speakers, and this completely puzzled look comes over his face, like, what in the heck is this? What am I hearing? And he leaves the crowd and walks right up to one of the speakers and is standing right there with his face against the speaker, right when Eddie lays into these drums, and he's going like bap, 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 and this guy's head goes bang, bang, bang. And he turns around to the crowd and he goes, "It's a miracle." So great memories. Anyway.
Yeah, just like my memories of Larry yesterday. I was putting on this piece by Count Basie, Me and You. And Count, you know Count Basie, he's always a So he's starting really slow, and Larry goes, turn it up, and it'll get louder. It goes ting, ting, and Larry goes up to the knob, starts turning it up, and then the band goes bam, and he flies back.
But I was okay after I picked myself up.
You were okay after you picked yourself up from the floor.
Well, let's see. I think I've rattled on probably long enough, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Is Ford Duke still in your catalog? Can you still get copies? You still bang?
No,
them
it's
out?
long out
Yeah,
of print.
I've got one, but I got one.
And
early,
that's
yeah.
a treasure you can hang on
Yeah.
to.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it was released as a CD, and you know, from the tapes and those
Yeah.
things, of course, are.
Yeah.
I think they're out of print as well, but they're relatively easy to come by. But with the limited pressing run of the direct-to-discs, once
that's it.
it's done, that is it. So I'm glad these things.
I know
exist.
you're hiding some somewhere.
Yeah. Play
You
some
know,
music.
it's funny you say that, but in fact, over the years, I've given away a lot of the copies of the things I had. People would say, "Oh, I love that." I go, "Here you go, can I have one?" So I still have, a small collection of my own, but I don't have many extras.
Okay, how many direct-to-discs are in your collection?
Oh, I don't know, but
Just
there's
ballpark.
maybe 30 or something like
Yeah.
that.
I got 24.
Okay. Questions? All right. Well then, Gary, did you want to follow up with anything? You want to talk about your experience?
Well,
Gary